It's a great honor to be with a number of very distinguished presenters who you've heard over the last day and a half or so. I also want to thank Viviana Ortiz and the group from Voxas, who you see helping us all. They've been terrific, making us feel comfortable and at home. And I do want to point out how quickly they recovered from the little crisis that we had a few minutes ago in terms of the power. By my count, it took about 4 minutes for them to get back up and running, so a very slight delay. In the United States, as you may know, we have an event in early February called the Super Bowl, which a lot of people in the US and I think a lot of people all over the world watch. And as you may recall, they had a power blackout at the New Orleans Superdome. It took them 34 minutes to recover with 108 million people watching. So you compare the ANH and Voxas response and the National Football League and the New Orleans Superdome, I think you can see who comes out ahead in that. Now, a couple of apologies before I start. First of all, you're going to be exposed to me for 90 minutes in a row. 2 separate presentations, one on the regulatory reforms that we put into place following Deepwater Horizon, and second, the structural reforms in terms of the agencies that regulate offshore drilling. So I apologize in advance. And there's a lot of material in these 2 presentations, so I will have to go quickly through some of it. Second apology is I am a generalist. I am not, as have been so many of the speakers before me, hard scientists, biologists. Mr. Perez, I'm sure, is a petroleum engineer based on the detailed analysis he just provided. I'm not. I'm a lawyer and an experienced government manager, which is, I think, the reason why I was asked to take over after the oil spill. So let's get started. First, very briefly, a little short history of offshore exploration in the US. It actually started at the end of the 19th century and not in Louisiana or Texas, but in fact in California. The first Gulf of Mexico discovery in state waters was several decades later in 1938. And here you have, on the rest of this slide, some milestones in the development of offshore exploration, including the first well drilled from a fixed platform in federal waters, which was 1947. And then in 1954, the first federal outer continental lease sale, which really began the modern era in lease sales and offshore development in the US. By 1957, there were already 446 production platforms in federal and state waters, and in 1962, you had the first semi-submersible platform. In 1960 and 62, you had 2 major lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico. And the rest of the 1960s, you had major advances in offshore technology. You had improvements in the quality of the kind of seismic data we heard about yesterday. You had, through good scientific work, greater understanding of the soil mechanics and the foundations offshore. You had improvements in materials that were used in offshore activity. And you also very significantly had computers that had the computing capacity to allow the kind of modeling of rigs and platforms that you needed. Now, in 1969, there was a seminal event in offshore development in the US, the Santa Barbara, California blowout and oil spill, which even 50 plus years later continues to resonate. There is no offshore drilling, exploratory drilling offshore California, and that's because of the bitter memories of this oil spill 44 years ago. Just continuing, so that's a little bit a snapshot of the history of offshore drilling. Now I want to talk very briefly about the way the offshore industry has been regulated in the US, and it has been a structure that's changed over time. Originally, you had the US Geological Survey, which is the primary US scientific agency within the Interior Department. And they were responsible, their conservation division were originally responsible for regulating offshore drilling, even though most of their work was done onshore. And early on, between 1958 and 1960, they issued some general orders that addressed some basic features of offshore activity, including drilling, plugging, and abandonment, well productivity, the installation of subsurface safety devices, and so on. But significantly, what these initial orders did not do was to specify design criteria or establish detailed standards. In addition, also very significantly, I would argue, there were no testing requirements. So companies were required to have certain equipment, but not required to test whether the equipment actually worked. Continuing onward, in 1973, there was a well-known National Science Foundation study that critically commented on certain aspects of the way offshore regulation was evolving. And it said, among other things, the closeness of government and industry and the commonality of their objectives have worked against the development of a system of strict accountability. One of the ways this worked in practice was that the USGS granted compliance waivers freely, even though their regulations were not very tough. Nevertheless, in response to requests from the industry, they were granted waivers. There were no regular inspections by USGS personnel, and this is unfortunately a continuing theme that continued up through Deepwater Horizon. The regulatory body itself was drastically underfunded and understaffed. You had, and this is not a joke, 12 people overseeing over 1,500 platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. As I mentioned before, you had the Santa Barbara blowout in 1969, and there were some immediate results of that blowout. There was a moratorium on drilling and production in California, and not surprisingly, accidents prompt action, and so 7 months later, there were new revised regulatory orders that were developed and implemented, and they were more specific about what companies needed to do and the equipment they needed to use. For the first time, these new orders claimed the authority to prohibit leasing where environmental risks were too high. Now, that was embedded in the original law that was passed in 1954, but the regulatory agency had never really acted on the authorization it had in the law. So for the first time, finally, shortly after the Santa Barbara oil spill, they recognized that they could prohibit leasing when the risks were too high. Just quickly going through some other important events. In 1970, you had two major blowouts that led to further strengthening of regulations. And then in 1982, you had the creation of the Minerals Management Service, which was the offshore regulatory agency in the U.S. from 1982 until Deepwater Horizon in 2010. In 1982, you had the concept of area-wide leasing introduced, which allowed leasing for over entire regions, the central Gulf of Mexico, the western Gulf of Mexico in particular. In 1985, you had another independent agency study deepwater and Arctic drilling, talking about the special safety risks of remote locations and harsh environments, and it pointed to deficiencies in the ongoing system for offshore safety oversight, including the quote that's reproduced here. From 1985 to 2010, offshore activity was blessed with no major offshore spills, which I think you can argue led to a sense of complacency, both within the industry, but also in the government regulatory body. So let me talk briefly about the U.S. regulatory approach pre-Macondo. There were a wealth of technical requirements that existed, and I've listed them here for pollution prevention and control, drilling, well completion, oil and gas well workovers, and so on. But various attempts over time, including those that bubbled up from within the agency, to modify and modernize the regulatory approach failed. There was a fatal accident offshore Louisiana that led to the MMS convening an internal task force and also soliciting recommendations from an independent scientific body, the National Research Council. But because the Exxon Valdez happened that same year, the focus was shifted to the spills that can result from shipping as opposed to offshore activity itself. And the result was that nothing came of the internal deliberations and the work of the National Research Council. So you've heard Dr. Perez talk about the details of the Macondo accident. I know all of you are familiar to some extent with that horrific accident. There was the blowout of the well, there was the sinking of the rig, there was the tragic deaths of 11 workers, and over the period of 87 days that Dr. Perez talked about, the spilling of 4.9 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. A true environmental catastrophe, most would argue the greatest environmental catastrophe in the history of the United States. What happened in the immediate aftermath of that on the governmental level? Within days, President Obama commissioned a 30-day report from Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar on, quote, what, if any, additional precautions and technologies should be required to improve the safety of oil and gas exploration and production operations on the Outer Continental Shelf. The report was delivered on time, within 30 days, and it included some immediate new prescriptive requirements, a suggestion that longer-term performance-based safety measures be put into place, and that working groups be established, manned by people from within the agency, but also outsiders, to explore on a longer-term basis some of the important safety issues that were raised by the accident. There was also a very controversial deepwater drilling moratorium that was put in place by the President and by Secretary Salazar starting at the end of May, based on the idea that we still didn't know enough about what had caused the accident, and we needed to explore further to determine whether it was safe for deepwater drilling to continue. The moratorium did a number of things. It allowed for the implementation of the steps that were recommended and that were capable of immediate implementation that had been contained in the 30-day report. But it also provided necessary time to gather information on the three central issues that were implicated by the Deepwater Horizon accident. First, what could be done to prevent blowouts and spills through new regulations? Second, what could be done to address the need for capabilities to contain the kind of subsea blowout we saw in Deepwater Horizon? And third, what can we do to enhance oil spill response? Because what became very evident almost immediately was that the technology for dealing with a spill had been frozen in the late 1980s. Very few technical or technological developments have been made in spill response since that time. So one of the first things I was asked to do by Secretary Salazar after he had imposed the deepwater drilling moratorium and after I had arrived at the Interior Department was to conduct a series of 8 public forums throughout the United States, mostly in the southern United States, in Texas, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, in Alabama, to gather information from experts from industry, from experts from the government, and from private citizens and members of environmental organizations to address those 3 issues, that is prevention, containment, and spill response. In the end, the moratorium itself was lifted after less than 5 months, in the middle of October of 2010, but no additional deepwater drilling permits were issued until February of 2011. What happened in the immediate wake of the accident? First of all, there were an unprecedented number of studies, reviews, and investigations. I think we heard from Dr. Perez about the BP internal review, but there were also a large number of governmental sponsored reviews. I've already mentioned the Secretary Salazar, and that's he pictured next to me, his 30-day report that was submitted to President Obama in May of 2010. Then separate from that, Secretary Salazar convened something he called the Outer Continental Shelf Safety Oversight Board report, which was delivered in September of 2010. Then there was a separate but related Department of the Interior Inspector General report that was delivered in December of 2010. There was then a presidential commission whose members were selected by President Obama that looked at a wide range of issues, but focusing for the most part on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill itself and the future of offshore drilling and many of the environmental considerations that were implicated. Then there was a separate investigation done by a combination of the Coast Guard and my agency, so the MMS was renamed BOMER, and that report was delivered in September of 2011. And last but not least, a very thorough report by the National Academy of Engineering and the National Research Council that was delivered in December 2011. So if any of you has an insatiable appetite for information about these investigations, I would recommend dipping into them. They're all good. They all have very strong points. In terms of sheer scope and readability, I would recommend you're looking at the President's Commission report, which is extremely well done, extremely meticulous, and remarkably easy to read even for a non-technician. So what was the result of even the first of these reviews and investigations that started to flow in? Well, what they did was to highlight the truly profound weaknesses in both the industry's and government's efforts to adequately address these three issues: prevention, containment, and spill response. But the accident certainly also served as a painful but necessary wake-up call for industry, for government, and for the public, which was newly sensitized to the risks of offshore drilling. And it prompted these comprehensive reviews of existing safety technologies, practices, risk management, regulations, and so forth. And the goal really collectively of all these efforts was to try to make lasting and though immediate improvements across the board. And what we received were fresh assessments of these critically important and highly complex issues of prevention, containment, and spill response. So what were the initial regulatory steps? Well, in the immediate aftermath of the 30-day report, you had some notices to lessees that were put out. These are not new regulations. They are interpretations and applications of existing regulations. And so here you have, and I won't go through them in detail, the new requirements that were contained in an NTL that was issued on June 8th of 2010. One of the significant requirements, and this was a first in the offshore space, was the requirement that the CEOs of companies certify compliance with all required regulations. This was borrowed from some other recent U.S. laws that were put into effect after some of the financial fraud cases of the early 2000s, where the idea was, let's make the top executives of these companies, not simply people lower down in the chain of command, be personally responsible for making sure their companies are complying with all applicable rules. NTL 5 was followed by NTL 6, which dealt largely with worst case discharge and worst case and blowout scenarios. It required companies to provide very detailed information on worst case spills, including flow rates, total volumes, and the maximum duration of the spill, and also mandated providing specifics on drilling the relief well that Dr. Perez talked about early. It also required that companies share all the assumptions and calculations of their worst case discharge. And I guess the best comparison is when we did work in algebra and geometry, the teachers made us show our work, right? Not just come up with the right answer. And really the same principle applied here. The agency was now for the first time insisting that we wanted to see the basis for those calculations by learning about what all the assumptions were. The first major change in drilling regulation came at the end of September. It had been in the works almost from the day of the spill and really moved into high gear and based much of what it did on the 30-day report that Secretary Salazar had submitted to the President. So that new rule did not go through the normal regulatory process in the U.S., which is a lengthy notice and comment process, which can take up to a year, in many cases a year and a half. I think everyone realized that we didn't have the time for that. And so there is a procedure that rules can be put in place on an emergency basis, and that was what was done here. So the new drilling safety rule, which is what we called it, was announced on September 30th. It was immediately effective on publication in what's called the Federal Register, the document that contains all federal regulations. And then over a period of a little less than 2 years, and the truth is it shouldn't have taken that long, it was revised and very slightly modified and issued as a final rule on August 15th, 2012. But in the meantime, I want to emphasize that enacted as an emergency rule, it was fully applicable to all operations, and all companies working offshore had to comply with them. So the drilling safety rule implemented many of the recommendations that had been contained in the 30-day report and that had also been contained in NTL 5. And there were new requirements, new quite difficult requirements for wellbore integrity and for well control equipment. Those were the two main categories. So let me, in not too great a detail, but in some detail, go through what those were. In terms of wellbore integrity, there were new requirements relating to casing and cementing. The new casing requirements included requirements that related to installation, sealing, and locking of the casing. Importantly, for the first time, there was a requirement that a professional engineer had to certify the casing and the cementing programs that were in the applications to drill that were submitted to the regulatory agency. In addition, there were new casing and cementing integrity tests, and this also relates to something that Dr. Perez talked about, a requirement of 2 independent test barriers across each flow path during well completion, and that had to be certified by a professional engineer. In addition, you can see here regulatory approval in the case that a company wanted to substitute lighter drilling fluids for the heavier drilling fluids that they had originally said that they were going to use in their original drilling program. In addition, additional deep water well control training for everyone who would be involved in well control related activities. Now moving on to the new requirements for well control, not wellbore integrity. Companies were required to submit schematics for all the well control systems that they were planning to employ. There were a broadened set of testing requirements for BOPs. There were requirements established for the first time for ROV capabilities that had to exist in connection with offshore drilling programs. There were new requirements for auto shear and deadman systems. There had to be documentation of subsea BOP inspections and maintenance. And then finally, heightened requirements for personnel who were actually authorized to operate the BOP equipment that was being used in an operation. So these new requirements were numerous and they were quite substantial. And so in the real world, what was the reaction, what was the implementation of those new rules? Well, in the immediate aftermath of the accident, there was a broad consensus that the prescriptive rules that the agency had relied on had fallen behind, in many cases far behind technological advances in the industry. And the new requirements that were contained in the NTLs 5 and 6 and in the drilling safety rule were broadly accepted by everyone as necessary and in fact overdue. There was a logical progression from the 30-day report to the NTLs to the drilling safety rule. And so what that meant was that industry was not blindsided by the drilling safety rule. It really had a significant amount of advance notice and time to adjust to the new requirements that it was expected to comply with. What we then did was to make a point of meeting with individual companies and groups of companies to answer their questions. We conducted numerous workshops to try to explain how the new requirements would apply, to answer questions that operators were raising. And I think one measure of the soundness of the new rules was validated by the very small number of changes that were made between the original rules enactment in September and October of 2010 and it's being made final in August of 2012. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the three major issues that we focused on in the immediate aftermath of the accident was containment, subsea containment. The fact is there had been almost a complete absence of subsea containment capabilities to deal with the possibility of a subsea blowout. I think that failure in retrospect was shocking, both with respect to industry and with respect to the government. There was a collective failure to anticipate the need for the capability. And during the 87 days where CNN and other networks showed you the oil continuing to flow into the Gulf of Mexico, we all heard about these improvised techniques that BP and the government team that was working with them, with the assistance of many other people from other parts of the industry, how they were trying to contain the spill. They had a containment dome that didn't work because of problems relating to hydrates. There was the attempt to throw golf balls at it. I don't know how many of you remember that, with techniques called the top kill and the junk shot. The fact was that everyone was going based on trial and error because none of this had been thoroughly researched, reviewed, and planned for in advance. Finally, a new device was fabricated, the capping stack, and it was successfully installed on July 12, 2010. I can tell you that up until the moment it was put in place and testing was done on it, there was not a high degree of confidence that it would work. So many of the other strategies and methods had failed that people were not at all confident that this one would work, but it did. And the oil stopped flowing on July 15, 2010. What we did in November of 2010 was to impose a requirement that operators demonstrate a capability to deal with a subsea blowout that had never been required before. And industry, I think, seeing around the corner a little bit, formed two consortia in the summer of 2010 designed to get together the equipment and the tools necessary to provide the containment resources necessary to deal with a subsea blowout. One was called the Marine Well Containment Company, which is primarily composed of the majors, and the other one was called the Helix Group, which was primarily composed of smaller and independent operators. And both of those consortium moved ahead starting in July of 2010 to acquire the equipment, including the capping stacks, necessary to contain a subsea blowout. But they were not prepared. They finished at just about the same time, and they finished in about February of 2011. So even though the deepwater drilling moratorium had ended in the middle of October, we did not, we could not, we should not have given out deepwater drilling permits until companies were able to demonstrate by establishing contracts with one of these two consortia that it had the equipment, it had the know-how, it had the wherewithal to deal with a subsea blowout. And both of the consortia finally did that in February of 2011. So I've talked about the drilling safety rule, and that really adhered to the traditional historical US model. Prescriptive. Here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. Do this, do that, do the other thing. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. And that regulatory model is not unique to the offshore industry or to the energy industry more generally. It is the US regulatory model that is used almost without exception across industries. Now, many of you know of two major accidents in Europe, the Alexander Kielland offshore Norway and the Piper Alpha offshore the UK. And those accidents caused revolutions, really transformations in the regulatory models that were used in the North Sea. And they went from a more or less prescriptive model to what they called a performance-based model. And what that did, and I'm simplifying greatly here, and there are distinctions and differences between the Norwegian model and the UK model, but under a general set of guidance and standards that the government regulatory agency establishes, the companies, the operators, are responsible for doing a detailed set of hazard analyses and risk analyses, which they then submit to the government regulator. So much of the responsibility for doing the analysis is shifted onto the individual company, and much less responsibility is on the shoulders of the government agency. In 1991, seeing what was going on with these two accidents and the coming changes in the European regulatory models, the MMS requested comments on different strategies to promote safety and environmental protection. But sadly, over the course of 20 years, from 1991 until 2010, efforts on the part of MMS to adopt risk-based, performance-based regulatory models were blocked by a combination of industry and political appointees within the Department of the Interior, including the heads of MMS. Now, MMS encouraged the voluntary adoption of such programs. Some companies did it, some companies didn't do it, but it certainly was not done across the board. Then in 2006, so after 15 years of having these initiatives blocked, there was an initial proposal for performance-based standards that was revived, but it was opposed at that time by industry. So finally, with the horrible accident of Deepwater Horizon, that created the necessary momentum to allow the agency to implement a rule that it had being developed for years and years and years. And it was proposed in 2009, ironically, even before Deepwater Horizon, although if I had to bet, I would bet that it would not have seen the light of day if Deepwater Horizon had not happened through a result of failure of nerve in the government and continued industry opposition. But that was peeled away with the accident, and instead we had the proposal in 2009 and the adoption again in October of 2010, so a very big month for new regulations in the US, of the Safety and Environmental Management System rule. And that made mandatory what had previously been voluntary practices that were contained in one of the API recommended practices, RP 75. Just a little note about the relationship between API standards and US regulation. In an ideal world, government agencies would have the capacity to develop their own rules. They would have the technical resources, they would have the human resources, they would have the engineering know-how, and so forth. Unfortunately, that has never been the case. And so, to a significant degree, I would argue to too great a degree, the agency has incorporated by reference API recommended practices. Now, one of the really cruel ironies that I discovered when I got to the Department of the Interior in 2010 was that even though API standards were incorporated by reference in many MMS regulations, if you were a member of the public and you went online and you tried to get access to the API recommended practice that was now part of government regulation, you couldn't do it. You had to pay for it. I found out about that and I called the executive director of API and I said, "You've got to be kidding. This is simply unacceptable." And after a lot of complaints and arguments that this would cost API lots of money if it was now giving this out for free to the public rather than charging, they agreed to do it. So now the API standards, at least, are available to the extent that they're incorporated in US regulations. that they're available to the public, although I think there are still some restrictions on printing them. So we have the SEMS rule, and the SEMS rule contains 13 elements, and again, it is really an adoption of the RP75 API recommended practice. And I won't go through all of these in detail. It's a long and complicated list, but I will point to just a couple of the requirements. Number 3, for example, is a facility-level hazards analysis and risk assessment. So these are what operators now have to do. It's mandatory, which they didn't have to do before. They also have to have done a complete analysis and have a program for management of change. They need to have more elaborate and detailed training protocols and so forth. So I know these materials will be handed out at the end of the conference. I invite you to look at them, but I don't want to spend any more time on going through each one of these at this point. Because many companies had not adopted the elements of SEMS on a voluntary basis, and because the intention was never to stop activity in the Gulf of Mexico in its tracks, we decided that industry would be given a year until November of 2011 before the government would consider any enforcement actions for failure to properly develop and implement a SEMS program. Now, we realized that although the SEMS rule was good as far as it went, there were additional elements that we wanted to add to it. In the original form of the rule, there was an option to allow companies to do the audits themselves or to have an independent third-party auditor. I frankly thought that we needed to have a mandatory requirement that it be a third-party independent auditor, and so that is one of the reforms that was in the proposed rule that we called SEMS 2. And the proposal was put out in September of 2011 through a variety of reasons that occurred after I left. It's still bottled up in the agency and hasn't been released. And it's going to be changes around the edges of SEMS. It's not going to be a marked change from the original SEMS rule. So what has happened as a result of Deepwater Horizon to the U.S. regulatory model? Interestingly, in the 30-day report and in the President's Commission report, they recommended the adoption of the safety case, which, broadly speaking, really is a reference to what's used in the UK and Norway. And we fully considered it, but decided against its immediate adoption for several reasons. One, the realities of the industry activity, and so forth, argued against the immediate, on-the-spot, wholesale transformation of the regulatory model in the U.S. In talking to people who had been through that transformation in the U.K., I was told that industry was largely shut down for a period of close to a couple of years in the mid-90s. And that's something that really could not gain broad acceptance in the U.S. Then you had, as another factor, the dominance of the prescriptive model in the U.S. and its broad acceptance everywhere in the United States Congress, among the public, and so forth, where arguably industry failed. I thought was too large a step to take. But what SEMS is really the first and extremely important step towards a hybrid regulatory model in the U.S. that will have, for the first time, performance-based elements on top of or in tandem with the prescriptive regulations that we've had for years and years and years, and that have now been enhanced as a result of the new drilling safety rule. And I think what we may well see is a future where there are additional prescriptive regulations and additional performance-based regulations.
Se han perforado 140.000 pozos profundos, siendo Macondo un caso excepcional. ¿Qué recomendaciones tendría para las autoridades colombianas para formular la regulación con base en la norma y no en la excepción?
I think if I were inventing the US regulatory system from scratch, it would not look the way it does. So I think, as I understand it, you in Colombia, you and ANH are in a position where you are able to really start from almost the starting line. And I would highly recommend that you look carefully, as I'm sure you're doing, to both the US regulatory model and cherry pick the strengths of it, but also look at the performance-based models that are in place in places as different as the UK, Norway, Australia, and Canada, and figure out what makes the most sense in terms of your regulatory culture and, frankly, your political culture. I think there are a number of different alternatives that would provide the kind of system of regulation that would be adequate for your needs. But I would be reluctant, certainly if I were you, to think that a model like the US's or a model like Norway's could simply be imported as a whole. So I think that it's very important to try to figure out the appropriate match for the level and kind of activity you anticipate here, and what the appropriate regulatory model would be given these factors, including your regulatory and political culture, that makes the most sense.